Hi everyone, and thanks for watching this webinar titled Reducing Daily Water Demand and How Does Climate Action Initiative. So the topics we're going to go through today will be what are the likely impacts of climate change on the water services sector and more specifically on the group water scheme sector, how your group water scheme can take some small steps to prepare for the effects of climate change. We're going to look at water demand across your system, then focusing on a case study of West Limerick Group Water Scheme and how they best reduce their daily water demand. Going to briefly touch on energy audits, and then we're going to have a look at some group water schemes that have implemented renewable energy and how they've seen both energy savings and climate savings as a result. So we firstly ask ourselves, what is climate change? So climate change is defined as the predicted rise in the Earth's temperature, which ultimately results in an increased frequency of extreme weather events. So we're all familiar with the drought of 2018 and how we're having more storms in our winters, increased flooding, high wind events. So these things are going to become more and more frequent and common as the Earth's temperature continues to rise and our climate changes as a result. The illustration there on the left-hand side, just the first two pictures show how the Earth's temperature is going to rise over the coming decades, and below it shows how the average precipitation rate, so the average rainfall rate, in many parts of the planet is going to increase as well. So if we look at the effects of climate change and the group water scheme sector, so firstly, how do group water schemes fit into this unfolding scenario? Well, firstly, raw water sources are going to be impacted by extreme weather events. So with increased rainfall comes the likely occurrence of runoff from our lands into our water sources. So this may increase the turbidity of our water supplies, and also we might have a higher chance of coliforms and E. coli as a result. So with maybe increased turbidity, this of course will have an increased pressure on our filtration systems. So we'll have more sediment, and maybe the filtration systems currently in place mightn't be enough to handle the changes that are likely to come with climate change. There may be disruption to power supply. So we often see during times of storm how there's several parts of the country that are without power. This too will have a knock-on effect on group water schemes. In particular, the group water schemes that maybe don't have enough storage and also don't have access to a power generator, for example. There may be restricted access to sites as a result of flooding, or roads that maybe become impassable due to fallen trees and so on. And also changes to drinking water parameters. For example, if we look at nitrates, there are several group water schemes out there across the country that maybe a decade ago nitrates weren't a concern for them. And now with the increased dry summers and the more choppy winter events that we're having, they're seeing changes in their nitrate levels, and they are rising in certain sections of the country. So is the group water scheme sector contributing to the problem of excessive carbon emissions? Well, a rise in CO2 in our atmosphere is ultimately what causes climate change and global warming. And if we think to ourselves, does the group water scheme sector negatively affect this? And I suppose the answer in short is yes. I mean, for as long as we rely on fossil fuel as our main driver of energy sources, we as a sector, amongst many other sectors in the country, are a player in adding to the effects of climate change. Electricity is the single biggest operational expense in the drinking water sector across both public and private supplies. And I know there's many group water scheme committee members listening today who know that year on year their single biggest cost is their electricity bill. So we're going to look at maybe ways in which we can reduce this and not save but just in money, but also without reducing our carbon footprint too. So some simple preparatory measures your group water scheme can take we'll be looking firstly at well level sensors. So this is really applicable to our borehole groundwater supplies out there. So I mean, it's one thing looking at how much water we have across our network, how much water is being consumed, you know, in our mains and on our consumer side, but how much water do we have available in the first place for our members? So, you know, with maybe increased droughts, how's our water levels going to be affected? So following on from the 2018 drought, there were 19 group water schemes in Tipperary that installed these well level sensors. And particular credit to go out to Tipperary County Council and the Rural Water Services there, who were really leaders in bringing the schemes together and providing funding and assistance to getting these well level sensors installed. The top graphic there just shows a snapshot of one of these 19 schemes, and it shows how their water level changed and trend over a 12-month period. So the more data group schemes have like this, they can better prepare for climate change and maybe with changes into their water supply. So they might have less water to play with than they would have been used to before. But this is all fundamental data that will help assist them and better prepare. Weather stations too, we touched on earlier how our raw water can change as a result of weather events. So if group water schemes can link weather events, maybe such as dry spells, storm events, flooding, high winds, they can relate those directly to their water quality. Again, it's valuable data that they can have to better equip themselves. Many group water schemes have gone so far as installing these weather stations on their local primary schools that are connected to their network. And what this does, it not only is a way for group water schemes to engage with their local community, but it's also educating the younger generations to come about this important link between water quality and weather. So if we look at water demand then across our sector, so firstly, what is it? Well, water demand relates to accounted for water firstly, and this is the water that we can record and document. So our water that we can see on our bulk meter in our pump house, across our district metered areas on our network, and also on our consumer side, so on our house connections, farm connections. This is our accounted for water. And we also have our unaccounted for water. So water that leaves our pump house but gets lost on our mains and also on the consumer side. So water demand is both accounted for and unaccounted for water. And to establish water demand, it's imperative that group water schemes keep regular bulk, district and consumer meter readings. So it's next to impossible for a group water scheme to know how much water is being used if they don't regularly have their bulk meter readings in their pump house, their district meter readings on their network, and also their consumer meters. So many schemes out there might have certain types of telemetry installed on their bulk and district meters that feeds to their phone or to their laptop. But similarly, for group schemes that don't have that technology in place, it's crucial that you're visiting the pump house or manually going out to read your district meters and your bulk meters in order to get this data so that you can firstly establish what the water demand is on your network. And next, once you know what your water demand is, it's to establish what your unaccounted for water is. And we'll look on the next slide how group schemes can calculate that. But after identifying your water demand and your unaccounted for water, the next step, I mean, it's all well and good having the data written down, but how do you put it into play? How do you take it into account? So the next thing would be to pinpoint the locations on your network that are most at fault for your unaccounted for water. So do you have particular sections of mains that are prone to leaks and that are constantly leaking? And do you have sections maybe on your farm connections or your house connections that are using more than they should? So with this in place, you have to have the correct furniture, if you like. You have to have the correct meters there. You have to have every connection metered. You have to have your district metered areas in place. And then you can get a better picture of how much water firstly your scheme is using and how much water your scheme really should be using, so you can reduce the water levels down. So if we look at unaccounted for water, this can commonly be referred to as well as a group water scheme carrying a water audit out. So step one would be firstly to record the total water pumped on your bulk meter in your pump house. So say if you do an example of a 12-month period, so if your group water scheme does this in January of every year, they take into account how much water left our pump house in that 12-month period. And then you look at your consumer meters, so your house and farm connections, and you look at how much water was consumed. So we know how much water we supplied to the system and how much water was consumed on the system. The difference between the two is your unaccounted for water, and this is commonly represented as a percentage difference. So if we take an example of a group water scheme here, they have 389 domestic only connections, they have 9 domestic and land connections and 32 land only connections. So it's predominantly a domestic driven scheme. They know that in a 12-month period they pumped 74,314 meters cubed, and they could account for 54,512 meters cubed, leaving an unaccounted for water figure of 26%. Now, that's the first step, and at least this group water scheme knows what their unaccounted for water level is. And you could argue that, yes, while this is good, I mean, it's less than the 30% mark, but there definitely is room for improvement here. But this group water scheme now should be taking strides to reduce it as low as 20%, and if not lower even still. But they would know now, if they had these district metered areas in place, which the scheme does, they know now the certain sections of main that is using an acceptable amount. I mean, we look at the houses there, 389. The general rule of thumb is that a house should be using 0.5 cubes of water per day. They can do a simple exercise to see, is each house following that rule of thumb? Are there houses and sections and mains that are going way above that? And they can then make a targeted approach based on this data. Where you can see, without group water schemes, at least doing this simple practice, it's next to impossible to know how to get a handle on our water demand as a whole. We'll look at a group water scheme here, West Limerick, who did excellent work in reducing their daily water demand, and then the savings that they saw then obviously as a result. So the first step they did before even lowering the water demand was getting the pressure right on the system. This group water scheme had certain sections and mains that was always prone to leakage. So no matter how many times they fixed it, it would occur time and time again. 95% of the leaks on this group water scheme was on the main, and as a result, it could cost the scheme as much as €800 a day, both to supply this water, fix this leaks, and so on. So the first thing they did, they didn't have district meter areas in place, so they set up 4 zones in the network. So district meter area 1, 2, 3, and 4, in order to target and firstly address these ones in a more sectored base. These were established then following on from that, and the pressure reducing valves were then installed. So they knew, right, if we take it section by section, we can install the PRVs, pressure reducing valves in each section, and firstly lower the pressure in these pipes. And by doing that, they weren't prone to as much leakage. And you can see here over that 5-year period into 2015, they were supplying water of 226,830 cubes. And this went down as low as 124,000 cubes. So by just getting the pressure right, they reduced their leaks and were able to save this much in usage, which is a 50% overall reduction. When they had the pressure right, with the savings that they could make, money savings, because they weren't obviously paying for as much leak repair and they weren't obviously pumping as much water into the system, they used this money to replace all leaking collars on their network. So by doing this, with the 2 measures combined, they were able to reduce their operational costs from 31,000 in 2015 as low as 17,000 in 2019. So overall, the group water scheme saw a reduction in their demand of just less than 87,000 meters cubed over a 5-year period. And if we look at this in terms of our carbon footprint, this was a saving of 11 tons of CO2. And 11 tons of CO2 is roughly what 20 Irish homes would use in a year or output in a year. And this is just one group water scheme. It's not a massive scheme. And if we can think if there was maybe 5 or 10 or 20 more schemes that follow suit, the real not only money saving to both the group water scheme and to the exchequer, but also in terms of reducing our CO2 output as a sector. If we look at the multi-annual rural water programme that I'm sure every scheme out there is familiar with, that's currently in place, there's been changes in this programme and group water schemes now that ultimately need mains replacement. So if you know that leakage repair isn't going to just solve the problem and that really you need to replace sections of mains, there's now a 3-step process that group water schemes need to follow. So firstly, they'd have to put in place water demand management systems. That's everything we've just touched on, having your district meter areas in place, having your correct bulk meters, having your consumer meters, having all this kit in place, the correct furniture. Then group water schemes need to be actively fixing leakage. So it's not only just going out and repairing the leaks, but keeping a leak diary. So if you know that there's a section main that you are replacing 5 leaks on a year, document that down, keep a record of it. It's all vital information to make your case for funding. Be seen to be actively trying to lower your unaccounted for water as much as possible without having to replace sections of main. And then lastly, when all those 1 and 2 steps have been implemented, then applying for infrastructural renewal and rehabilitation. So every group water scheme now is going to have to demonstrate that they're actively going through these 3 steps. And we're encouraging group water schemes to be getting these ducks in a row now for when the next funding cycle opens up. So you can show and demonstrate that you have all this data to help better make your case for funding. And obviously in the meantime, for group water schemes to be reducing their unaccounted for water levels as much as possible. If we briefly look at an EU perspective, so this is just a snapshot there of the water consumption per person across the European Union. You can see Ireland here is 5th from the top. So on average, we're using 150 litres of water per day. across our public and private schemes. Now, really, we'd love to get that down to the Belgian figure of 100 litres. And there's many group water schemes out there that provide us with meter readings, and we can see that there are schemes where they're shown that the houses are using this on average and even less. But there are schemes out there where they're seeing that there's been an increase in consumer usage on their domestic side, and this is overall driving a rise in their overall usage. So it's just something to bear in mind, something we're constantly trying to work on as a sector to get our water demand down to reasonable and acceptable limits the whole time. If we look at a water conservation research project, so on Forum Ishka, the Federation ourselves, and DKIT, we're currently involved in a water conservation research project. And I'm sure many of you out there are familiar with this. You all would have received a survey that was sent to you via email, and we're actively encouraging every group water scheme out there to please complete this survey. To date, with 80 group water schemes that have completed it. It's anonymous, and it's just to capture the water conservation attitudes to our sector. It will take about 15 minutes to complete, and really the more data we get back in this, the more we'll better have an understanding as to the water conservation attitudes of the sector, and this will better equip us on how to tackle it into the future. We will be going on to take detailed research on 60 group water schemes. So many schemes would have furnished us with detailed meter readings, so both on their pump house side and on their consumer side. Again, all the data is going to be anonymous, but it's just to get a range of schemes. So schemes that are in the DBO, non-DBO, schemes that have management in place and are voluntary run, to see the change in attitudes, change in behaviour through a range of different group water scheme setups. So if there's any scheme out there that hasn't been approached and would love to kind of get involved and furnish us with this data, please get in touch with your development officer or myself. We'd be more than happy to take on the data. Again, it's going to be the first research of its kind in the group water scheme sector, and we'd love as much data as possible. I just included a little snapshot there of a text message that there's some group water schemes would regularly send out just sample text messages to their consumers, to their houses, just making them aware of water conservation, you know, basically just mentioning that the committee is actively trying to reduce water demand levels, you know, both to conserve water and to conserve costs. And again, it's just to get the message out there to your scheme. So if you have a house who's getting a text message like this once or twice a year, it's putting water conservation to the forefront of their mind. You're encouraging them to read their meter, and it's just kind of making that interaction with them the whole time. Now that meetings aren't able to happen as much, this can prove really vital in group schemes, just getting the message out there to the members. Energy audits. So if we take, say, group schemes that have a good handle on their water demand, so they know how to what their reasonable water demand should be, they've got good leakage control in place, they know what their unaccountable water levels is, an energy audit would be the next best step. So, for example, 5 group water schemes in Leinster had energy audits completed earlier this year, and really what it involves is a company coming out and they'll look at your pump house and your treatment system as a whole. They're going to analyse your pumping regime, they'll see if there's any savings that can be made with the alternative energy supplies, renewable energy, for example, and really it's all about driving down your energy costs and your energy consumption from a technical perspective. So some of the examples that we saw in the recommendations on these 5 group water scheme energy audit reports was the installation of roof-mounted solar panels. We saw variable speed drives being a recommendation, new pumps. Group water schemes are using old pumps that were proven to be inefficient. They were maybe pumping hard and fast, and maybe they needed to do a more gradual, slow pumping regime. Change an electricity supplier is often seen to be good practice on a yearly basis, and also large-scale solar panels. So if we take into account all of these recommendations combined across these 5 reports, if every group water scheme did what was recommended, it would result in kilowatt hour savings of 58,000 kilowatt hours. There'd be CO2 ton savings of just under 8 tons of CO2 would be saved, so it wouldn't be being put out into the atmosphere. In terms of money, there'd be monetary savings of €8,500 from the group schemes perspective combined, and this would result in savings to the exchequer, because obviously group water schemes are part funded. This would see savings of €7,000. So again, this is just 5 group water schemes ranging in size from 300 connections down to 100 connections. They're not massive, And if they could see these types of savings, there's just huge merit and potential for even more and more schemes that take part. If we look at a breakdown of savings now, so Blackstairs group water schemes in Wexford and Polecat Springs and Roscommon are examples of 2 group water schemes. Blackstairs installed renewable energy in the forms of hydropower, and Polecat Springs installed solar panels. So 2 group water schemes, different parts of the country, different parts of renewable energy, and combined they have seen energy savings of 40,000 kilowatt hours, which is enough energy to power 123 Irish homes in a 12-year period. So again, these are 2 group water schemes out there. They have got very different, one's surface water, one has groundwater in play. They're very different sizes, different parts of the country. And if more and more group water schemes out there follow suit and got involved, I mean, we could be able to save enough energy to power 200, 300, 400 Irish homes. So again, this is group water schemes that are leading the way. I mean, we can see here, the picture on the right shows the open day of Blackstairs group water scheme, and you can see there's a wide range of schemes that turned out on the day, local authorities, department officials. There was also the picture in the middle there shows Polecat Springs, so you can see the huge array of solar panels there that was installed, and Rath group water scheme on the right hand side, Offaly, another scheme that installs solar panels as well. These are 3 schemes that are leading the way. They see the merit in reducing the carbon footprint of their sector, and that's really what's driving them to do this. And we would love for any schemes who want to learn more or visit these schemes, please get in touch with us and we can help make this sector grow and grow as the years go by. Thanks very much for listening, everybody.